The smoke detector in my bedroom started screaming at 3 in the morning, and I knew immediately that my procrastination had finally caught up with me. I'm Derek Zimmerman, and I'd been meaning to get my chimney cleaned for the past 6 months. The problem wasn't that I forgot or that I couldn't afford it. The problem was living in Oakmont Heights, a planned community in Scottsdale, Arizona, where every single thing you did to your property required approval from the homeowners association. And the HOA president, Patricia Henderson, had made it her personal mission to make my life as difficult as possible. It started back in September when I first submitted my request to have a chimney sweep service come out. I know what you're thinking. Arizona, chimney. But yes, we get cold winters here, and my house was built in the 1990s with a beautiful stone fireplace that I actually used regularly from November through February. The chimney hadn't been cleaned since I bought the place 2 years ago, and I'd been using the fireplace pretty heavily last winter. I filled out the required HOA exterior maintenance request form, attached the chimney sweep company's business license and insurance information, and submitted it through the HOA portal. According to the community bylaws, they had 10 business days to approve or deny the request. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. I sent a follow-up email to Patricia. She responded 3 days later with a terse message saying my request was under review and required additional documentation. When I asked what documentation, she said I needed to provide proof that the chimney sweep service had worked in Oakmont Heights before and references from other community members. This was ridiculous, but I complied. I contacted Desert Clean Chimney Services and asked if they'd worked in my neighborhood before. They had, for the Johnsons on Maple Drive and the Cohens on Birch Lane. I got written statements from both families, attached them to my resubmission, and sent everything back to Patricia. Another 2 weeks went by. This time, Patricia claimed that the company's insurance didn't meet the community's requirements. I checked the bylaws myself. There were no specific insurance requirements listed beyond general liability coverage, which Desert Clean absolutely had. I pointed this out in another email. Patricia's response arrived 4 days later. She said that the board would need to vote on creating specific insurance requirements for chimney sweep services before my request could be approved. The next board meeting wasn't scheduled for another month. By this point, it was late October. I was frustrated but not yet truly concerned. I figured I could wait until after the November board meeting, get approval, and have the chimney cleaned before I really needed to start using the fireplace regularly. The November board meeting came and went. I attended via Zoom, sitting through an hour and a half of discussions about holiday decoration guidelines and community landscaping before they finally got to new business. Patricia brought up the insurance requirements for chimney sweeps, but instead of voting on it, the board decided they needed to research what other HOAs required. They tabled the discussion until December. I tried to stay calm. December in Scottsdale isn't that cold yet. I could manage another month. At the December meeting, Patricia announced that she'd been too busy with the holidays to research other HOA requirements. The discussion was postponed again until January. January arrived, and with it came an unusual cold snap. Temperatures were dropping into the 30s at night, sometimes lower. I wanted to use my fireplace, but I was genuinely worried now. I could see creosote buildup in the chimney when I shined a flashlight up there. I'm not an expert, but I knew enough to understand that creosote is incredibly flammable. I sent another email to Patricia, this time marking it as urgent. I explained my concerns about safety and asked if I could please just get temporary approval while the board figured out their insurance requirements. Her response made my blood boil. She wrote that if I was so concerned about safety, perhaps I should have thought about that before buying a house with a fireplace. She suggested I use my central heating like a normal person and stop trying to rush the board's decision-making process. I considered just calling the chimney sweep and having them come out anyway. But according to our HOA rules, any unapproved exterior maintenance could result in fines up to $500 per day until the violation was corrected. I'd already heard horror stories about Patricia's enforcement tactics from other neighbors. The Wilsons had gotten fined $7,000 for repainting their mailbox without approval, even though they'd used the exact same color it had been before. The January board meeting happened. I attended in person this time, determined to make my case directly. I brought printouts showing the creosote buildup, documentation about chimney fire risks, and even a letter from Desert Clean Chimney Services explaining that my chimney was overdue for cleaning and posed a safety hazard. Patricia listened to my presentation with her arms crossed and a pinched expression on her face. When I finished, she said that the board couldn't be bullied into making hasty decisions based on one resident's poor planning. She claimed I was being dramatic about the safety concerns and accused me of trying to create an emergency to circumvent proper procedures. The board voted 4-2 against creating an expedited approval process for my situation. Patricia looked satisfied as she announced the vote results. I left that meeting furious and scared. It was mid-January now, and I hadn't been able to use my fireplace for months. My heating bills were climbing because the central heat was far less efficient than the fireplace for warming my open-concept living area. A week later, I got a notice from the HOA. Patricia had submitted a formal complaint against me for having a dirty chimney that was visible from the street and created an aesthetic nuisance. The notice demanded that I clean my chimney within 30 days or face fines. I couldn't believe what I was reading. She was threatening to fine me for having a dirty chimney while simultaneously blocking my attempts to get it cleaned. I immediately sent a response detailing the entire timeline of my approval requests and pointing out the absurdity of her complaint. Her reply came within hours. She claimed that her blocking my requests and her filing a complaint were two separate issues, and that I should have found a way to maintain my property regardless of the approval process. She suggested I clean the chimney myself. I called a lawyer, Melissa Warner from Rodriguez and Associates in Phoenix. She reviewed all my documentation and told me I had a solid case for filing a lawsuit against the HOA. However, she warned me that these cases could take months or even years to resolve, and legal fees would likely run into the tens of thousands of dollars. I asked about getting an emergency injunction that would allow me to have my chimney cleaned while the lawsuit proceeded. Melissa said that was possible but would still require filing the lawsuit, paying filing fees, and waiting for a court date. She estimated we might be able to get before a judge in 4 to 6 weeks. I thanked her and said I'd think about it. The truth was, I didn't have tens of thousands of dollars sitting around for legal fees, and waiting another month or more wasn't really an option either. The 30-day deadline from Patricia's complaint was already ticking down. I started researching Patricia Henderson more carefully. It turned out she'd been HOA president for 7 years and had a reputation throughout Oakmont Heights for being impossibly difficult. Multiple families had moved out specifically because of conflicts with her. The HOA board consisted of 6 people, and 4 of them were essentially Patricia's friends who voted however she told them to vote. I attended the February board meeting, hoping to try one more time. Before the meeting started, I spoke with some other residents who were there. Everyone had a Patricia story. Carl Martinez told me she'd blocked his request to install solar panels for 8 months, until a state law was passed that explicitly prohibited HOAs from banning solar installations. Jennifer Torres said Patricia had threatened her with fines because her grass was 3¼ inches tall instead of the required 3 inches exactly. During the meeting, I requested time during the public comment period. Patricia looked annoyed but allowed it. I made my case again, focusing on the safety issues and the upcoming deadline on her own complaint against me. I kept my tone respectful and factual. When I finished, Patricia said the board would take my comments under advisement. Then one of her board cronies, Richard Holmes, spoke up. He said that in his opinion, I was clearly just a complainer who didn't respect the HOA process, and that the board should reject any future requests from me on principle. I felt my face get hot, but before I could respond, another board member, Thomas Kim, interrupted. Thomas was one of the two who'd voted in my favor at the last meeting. He said that he'd done some research on chimney cleaning requirements, and it was clear that blocking necessary safety maintenance could open the HOA up to serious liability if something went wrong. Patricia dismissed his concerns immediately. She said the HOA's liability insurance would cover any incidents, and besides, I was being dramatic about the risk. She moved to end discussion and proceed to the next agenda item. I left that meeting knowing I was out of options with the HOA. I called Melissa Warner the next morning and told her to start preparing a lawsuit. She said she'd have papers ready to file by the end of the week. That same day, I went ahead and called Desert Clean Chimney Services. I explained my situation to the owner, Frank Delgado. He was sympathetic and said he'd dealt with difficult HOAs before. We scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday morning. I figured that even if Patricia tried to fine me, I'd use those fines as additional evidence in my lawsuit. My safety was more important than her petty power games. The following Monday evening, I got home from work to find a certified letter stuck in my door. It was from Patricia, written on HOA letterhead, and it explicitly forbade me from having any chimney maintenance performed without board approval. The letter stated that the HOA had become aware I might be planning to violate community rules, and that if any service vehicles were seen at my property for chimney-related work, I would be fined $1,000 per day retroactive to the day the work was performed. She'd somehow found out about my appointment with Desert Clean. I immediately suspected that Frank Delgado had mentioned my address to another client in the neighborhood, and word had gotten back to Patricia. Oakmont Heights was like that. Everything got back to her eventually. I called Frank first thing Tuesday morning and canceled the appointment. I explained about the letter and the threats. He understood but said he couldn't keep the slot open indefinitely. If I wanted to reschedule, I'd need to give him at least a week's notice. I was backed into a corner. I contacted Melissa Warner again and asked about the timeline for an emergency injunction. She said the earliest court date she could possibly get would be mid-March, about 6 weeks away. The filing fees and her retainer would total $8,000 to start. I sat in my living room that evening, staring at my fireplace and trying to figure out what to do. The temperature outside was dropping into the high 20s that night. My central heating was running constantly, and my house still felt cold. The fireplace would have warmed the whole space beautifully, but the chimney was a hazard. That's when my neighbor, George Patterson, knocked on my door. George lived 2 houses down and had always been friendly. He said he'd heard about my situation from Jennifer Torres, and he wanted to let me know that he and several other neighbors were sick of Patricia's behavior. He asked if I'd be willing to attend an informal meeting at his house that Thursday evening to discuss options. I agreed immediately. Any support was better than fighting this battle alone. Thursday evening, I walked down to George's house and found about 15 other Oakmont Heights residents already there. Some I recognized from HOA meetings, others I'd only seen around the neighborhood. George introduced me to everyone and explained my situation for those who weren't familiar with it. The stories started flowing. Patricia had blocked Linda Anderson from replacing her broken garage door for 3 months, claiming the proposed replacement didn't match the community aesthetic, even though it was identical to the original. She'd threatened David Cruz with fines for parking his work van in his own driveway overnight, claiming commercial vehicles weren't allowed, even though the HOA bylaws only prohibited commercial vehicles over 1 ton. She'd rejected Susan Mitchell's request to plant a vegetable garden in her backyard, claiming it violated landscaping standards, even though the bylaws only addressed front yard landscaping. The list went on and on. Everyone in that room had a grievance against Patricia Henderson. George suggested we organize a petition to call for a special election to remove Patricia from the board. According to the HOA bylaws, if 25% of homeowners signed a petition, a special election would be triggered. Oakmont Heights had 140 homes, so we'd need signatures from 35 homeowners. We spent the rest of the evening drafting the petition language and dividing up the neighborhood into sections. Each person took responsibility for canvassing a certain number of streets. I volunteered to handle my street plus the 2 adjacent ones. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent every evening and weekend knocking on doors and explaining the situation. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Out of the 30 houses I visited, 27 people signed the petition immediately. The 3 who didn't were all friends of Patricia's. By the end of those 2 weeks, George collected all the signatures. We had 48 total, well above the required 35. George submitted the petition to the HOA board on a Monday morning, sending it via certified mail and email to create a paper trail. Patricia's response came that same evening. She sent an email to the entire community claiming that the petition was invalid because it didn't follow proper procedures. She cited an obscure bylaw about petition formatting requirements and said none of the signatures would be counted. I read the bylaw she referenced. It said petitions had to be submitted on paper measuring 8.5 by 11 inches with 1-inch margins. Our petition met all those requirements. Patricia was just making things up. George responded to her email with a point-by-point rebuttal, copying the entire community. He attached scanned copies of the relevant bylaws and showed exactly how our petition met every requirement. Patricia went silent for 3 days. Then on Thursday, she sent another community-wide email announcing an emergency board meeting for Saturday morning. The only agenda item was discussion of invalid petition and potential disciplinary action against residents who participated in petition fraud. Petition fraud. That was a new one. The Saturday meeting was packed. At least 40 residents showed up, far more than usually attended. Patricia looked uncomfortable seeing so many people there. She called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a speech about how the petition was an attempt to undermine the board's authority and how the people involved were trying to create chaos in the community. George interrupted her. He stood up and calmly asked Patricia to explain specifically which bylaw the petition had violated. She repeated her claim about formatting requirements. George asked her to show the bylaw to everyone present. Patricia pulled up the bylaw on her laptop and projected it on the screen. George then pulled up our petition on his phone and projected that too, using a screen-sharing app. He went through each requirement one by one, showing how our petition met every single criterion. Patricia's face turned red. She claimed that the signatures themselves hadn't been properly notarized. George pointed out that the bylaws didn't require notarization for petitions. Patricia then claimed that some of the people who signed weren't current on their HOA dues, which would invalidate their signatures. Thomas Kim, the board member who'd been supportive of me before, spoke up. He said he'd reviewed the petition himself and found it to be completely valid. He moved that the board acknowledge the petition and schedule a special election within 30 days as required by the bylaws. Patricia looked furious. She tried to rule Thomas's motion out of order, but Richard Holmes, surprisingly, said he wanted to hear discussion on the motion. It turned out Richard was less of a sycophant than I'd thought. He was just conflict-averse and tended to go along with whoever was most forceful. But with 40 residents staring at him, he seemed to realize that going along with Patricia might not be the best strategy anymore. The board discussed the motion for 20 minutes. Patricia argued vehemently against it, claiming it would set a dangerous precedent and undermine the board's stability. But Thomas made a compelling case that ignoring a valid petition would expose the HOA to legal liability. Finally, they voted. Thomas and his ally Sarah Wung voted yes. Richard Holmes voted yes, clearly swayed by the crowd. The other two board members, Deanne Foster and Robert Martin, voted no along with Patricia. The motion passed 3-3 with Patricia's tie-breaking vote, except Patricia realized too late that she couldn't vote no on a motion that had already achieved a majority. She tried to claim that board president votes didn't count toward the majority, only as tiebreakers, but Thomas pulled up the bylaws again and showed that all board members' votes counted equally. Patricia had no choice but to acknowledge that the motion had passed. The special election was scheduled for the last Saturday of March, about 4 weeks away. Any board member could be challenged, and any homeowner in good standing could run for the board. You needed signatures from 5 other homeowners to get on the ballot. I immediately decided to run for Patricia's seat. George decided to run too, along with 2 other residents I didn't know as well, Marcus and Tyler. We all easily got our 5 signatures. Patricia announced she would run for re-election. Deanne Foster and Robert Martin, her 2 consistent allies, also announced they'd run to keep their seats. Thomas, Sarah, and Richard all declined to run again, saying they were tired of the political drama. The campaign period was intense. Patricia sent out multiple emails to the community attacking George, Marcus, Tyler, and me personally. She claimed I was running purely out of spite because I didn't like following rules. She said George was trying to eliminate all community standards and turn Oakmont Heights into a free-for-all. Her attacks on Marcus and Tyler were similarly baseless. We took a different approach. George created a simple website outlining our shared platform, reasonable enforcement of HOA rules, timely responses to homeowner requests, and transparent decision-making. We each wrote brief statements about our backgrounds and why we wanted to serve on the board. I spent hours knocking on doors again, this time campaigning. The response was even more positive than during the petition drive. People were tired of Patricia's authoritarian approach. They wanted an HOA that handled basic community maintenance and enforced reasonable standards, not one that micromanaged every tiny detail of their lives. 1 week before the election, something happened that changed everything. I was at work on a Wednesday afternoon when my phone rang. It was George. He sounded upset. He told me that Patricia's house had caught fire that morning. Nobody was hurt, but there'd been significant damage to her kitchen and living room. My first reaction was concern. I didn't like Patricia, but I certainly didn't want her house to burn down. I asked George what had happened. He said the fire department was still investigating, but early reports suggested it had started in or near the fireplace. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Over the next few days, more information came out. Patricia had been using her fireplace regularly all winter. Like me, she hadn't had her chimney cleaned in a long time. Unlike me, she'd never even submitted a request to have it cleaned because, as HOA president, she apparently thought the rules didn't apply to her. The fire started when creosote buildup in her chimney ignited. The flames spread from the chimney into the walls and then into her kitchen. She'd been home when it started and had smelled smoke. She called 911 immediately, and the Scottsdale Fire Department responded within minutes. They contained the fire before it spread to the rest of the house or to neighboring properties, but the damage was extensive. The fire inspector's report became public record within a week. It confirmed that the fire had been caused by creosote ignition in an improperly maintained chimney. The inspector noted that the chimney hadn't been cleaned in at least 3 years, possibly longer, and that the creosote buildup was severe. The report also noted that the homeowner should have been aware of the need for regular chimney maintenance, and that the fire could have been prevented with basic upkeep. I felt a strange mix of emotions reading that report. Part of me felt vindicated I'd been right about the dangers of an unclean chimney, and Patricia's own negligence had proved my point in the worst possible way. But another part of me felt genuinely bad for her. Her house was damaged, she was probably traumatized, and her insurance rates were definitely going to skyrocket. The election happened as scheduled. Patricia withdrew from the race 2 days before, citing the stress of dealing with her house fire and insurance claims. Deanne Foster and Robert Martin stayed in the race but lost badly. George, Marcus, Tyler, and I all won seats on the board. 2 other new members, Amanda Wright and Lisa Chang, won the remaining seats. Our first board meeting happened the following week. We elected George as the new president. One of our first actions was to review all pending homeowner requests that Patricia had been sitting on. There were 17 of them, some dating back over a year. We approved 13 immediately, requested additional information on 3 that had incomplete submissions, and denied only 1 that clearly violated community rules. Then George brought up my chimney cleaning request specifically. He moved that we approve it immediately, given the obvious safety issues. The vote was unanimous. I called Frank Delgado at Desert Clean Chimney Services the next morning. He remembered me and said he could fit me in that same week. 2 days later, he and his crew showed up at my house. They spent 3 hours cleaning the chimney thoroughly, removing pounds of creosote buildup. Frank showed me the debris they'd pulled out and said I'd been right to be concerned the buildup had been severe enough that a chimney fire was a real possibility. The bill was $350. Money well spent, but the story doesn't end there. About 2 weeks after the new board took over, I got a call from Detective Sarah Morrison at the Scottsdale Police Department. She asked if I could come down to the station to answer some questions about Patricia Henderson and the HOA. I was confused, but agreed. I went down that afternoon and met with Detective Morrison in a small conference room. She explained that the insurance company investigating Patricia's house fire had found some irregularities in the HOA's financial records and had referred the matter to the police. It turned out Patricia had been embezzling money from the HOA for years. The insurance investigation had uncovered this by accident when they were reviewing Patricia's financial situation to determine her claim payout. They'd noticed that she had been making regular deposits into her personal account that didn't match her stated income. When they dug deeper, they found the deposits coincided with HOA maintenance projects that had been billed but never actually performed. Detective Morrison asked me about various HOA expenses and projects I might remember. Did I recall the fence repair project that supposedly happened 2 years ago? Did the community landscaping upgrade that was billed 18 months ago actually occur? I told her truthfully that I'd only lived in Oakmont Heights for 2 years and hadn't paid much attention to HOA projects during my first year. But I gave her George's contact information, along with several other long-term residents who would have better knowledge of the community's history. Over the next month, the investigation expanded. The police brought in forensic accountants to review the HOA's books going back 7 years, the entire duration of Patricia's presidency. What they found was shocking. Patricia had created fake invoices from various vendors for projects that never happened or had been vastly overbilled compared to the actual work performed. She'd been siphoning money into accounts belonging to shell companies she controlled, then transferring it to her personal accounts. The total amount embezzled was over $280,000. The police arrested Patricia in mid-May. The charges included multiple counts of theft, fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The story made the local news, and suddenly, Oakmont Heights was famous for all the wrong reasons. The HOA hired a law firm to help recover the stolen money and to advise us on our legal obligations. We learned that we needed to file a claim with our insurance company for the theft, conduct a full financial audit, and send detailed accounting to all homeowners explaining what had happened. It was a mess. George, as the new president, bore the brunt of the work dealing with lawyers, insurance adjusters, and concerned homeowners. But all of us on the new board pitched in where we could. Patricia's criminal case moved through the court system slowly. Her lawyer initially tried to argue that the HOA's financial records were too disorganized to prove embezzlement, but the forensic accountants had done their job well. The evidence was overwhelming. In September, Patricia accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of theft and 3 counts of fraud. The sentencing happened in October. The judge gave her 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, though everyone knew we'd probably never recover most of the money. Meanwhile, life in Oakmont Heights slowly returned to normal. The new board implemented a bunch of reforms to prevent future abuse. We required 2 board members to sign off on all expenses over $500. We brought in an independent accounting firm to manage the HOA's finances and produce monthly reports that were shared with all homeowners. We created clearer procedures for homeowner requests, with specific timelines and appeal processes if requests were denied. We also revised the rules to be less intrusive. Front yard landscaping still had to meet certain standards, but backyard regulations were loosened. The ridiculous grass height requirements were eliminated in favor of a general standard that lawns be maintained. Approval processes for routine maintenance were streamlined. The community responded positively. Attendance at board meetings dropped off, which we actually took as a good sign. It meant people felt the board was handling things competently and didn't need constant oversight. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my fireplace that next winter. I made sure to schedule annual chimney cleaning in advance and submitted the request through the new streamlined process. It was approved within 24 hours. On a cold evening in December, nearly a year after this whole ordeal had started, I sat in my living room with a fire crackling in the fireplace. The warmth felt amazing, But even better was the satisfaction of knowing that the fight had been worth it. I'd stood up against an abusive HOA president, helped organize a community response, won a seat on the board, and been part of implementing real reforms. Patricia's embezzlement and subsequent arrest weren't things I'd anticipated or wanted, but in a way, they'd validated everything. She'd been corrupt and power-hungry, and the system had finally held her accountable. George called me that evening as I was sitting by the fire. He wanted to discuss agenda items for the next board meeting, but after we finished the business discussion, we talked about how much had changed in just 1 year. He told me he'd driven past Patricia's house recently. It had been repaired and was up for sale. Patricia's husband had divorced her shortly after her arrest, and the house was being sold as part of the divorce settlement. George said he hoped whoever bought it would be a good neighbor and nothing like Patricia. I agreed. Then I asked George if he'd run for re-election when his term was up the following year. He laughed and said he'd think about it. Being HOA president was more work than he'd expected, but it was also rewarding to see the community functioning better. We hung up, and I went back to enjoying my fire. My mind wandered back through the whole experience. From that first rejected chimney cleaning request in September to Patricia's arrest in May to sitting here now, it had been an exhausting journey, but it had also been empowering. I'd learned a lot about HOAs, about community organizing, and about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. I'd also learned that people who abuse power often have other things to hide. Patricia's obsessive need to control every aspect of the HOA had partly been about her personality, but it had also been about keeping people from looking too closely at what she was doing behind the scenes. The next morning, I woke up to my smoke detector chirping. For a split second, panic shot through me, but then I realized it was just the low battery warning. I replaced the battery and made a mental note to check all the detectors in the house. That brief moment of panic had reminded me how easily things could have gone wrong. If I'd caved to Patricia's pressure and used my fireplace without getting the chimney cleaned, my house could have caught fire just like hers did. People could have been hurt. Or if I'd given up on the HOA battle and just accepted her arbitrary authority, she might still be president, still embezzling money, still making life miserable for everyone in the community. I thought about all the other Patricia Hendersons out there in HOAs across America. How many of them were abusing their power right now? How many homeowners were dealing with the same kind of arbitrary denials and petty tyranny I'd experienced? And how many of those HOA presidents were also stealing money, knowing that most homeowners don't pay close attention to financial details? It was a sobering thought, but it also reminded me why the fight had been important. Someone had to push back. Someone had to say no and organize resistance and demand accountability. That weekend, I ran into Jennifer Torres at the grocery store. She thanked me again for everything I'd done with the HOA situation. She said her life had genuinely improved since the new board took over. She'd recently installed a small deck in her backyard, something Patricia had blocked her from doing for over a year, and the approval had come through in 3 days. Stories like Jennifer's made everything worthwhile. We weren't just dealing with abstract principles about HOA governance. We were affecting people's real lives and their ability to enjoy their homes. The following week, I attended a board meeting where we discussed long-term planning for the community. We talked about gradually building up the HOA's reserve fund to recover from the money Patricia had stolen. We discussed infrastructure projects that had been neglected during her presidency. We reviewed proposals from homeowners for various improvements. It was boring, practical stuff, and that was exactly how it should be. An HOA should be boring. It should handle routine maintenance, enforce reasonable standards, and otherwise stay out of people's lives. The drama of the past year had been necessary to get to this point, but I hoped we'd never have to deal with anything like it again. In December, about a year after I'd first sat in that community meeting and begged Patricia to let me clean my chimney, we held our annual HOA holiday party. It was much better attended than the previous year. People actually seemed to like their HOA now, or at least not actively hate it. I brought cookies, mingled with neighbors, and generally enjoyed being part of a functional community. George gave a brief speech thanking everyone for their patience during the transition year and outlining some goals for the year ahead. It was refreshingly free of political drama. As I was leaving the party, Amanda Wright, one of the new board members, stopped me. She said she'd been thinking about writing an article about our experience for a local community organizing newsletter. She thought other HOAs could learn from what we'd been through. She asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed. I said yes. If our experience could help other people dealing with abusive HOAs, that would be another positive outcome from all of this. Amanda and I met for coffee a few days later. I walked her through the whole timeline, from the first chimney cleaning request through Patricia's arrest, and the reforms we'd implemented. Amanda took detailed notes and asked thoughtful questions. Her article came out in February, published in a nonprofit newsletter focused on community organizing and housing issues. She'd changed names and some identifying details, but kept the core story intact. The response was overwhelming. Amanda got emails from people across Arizona and even from other states, all dealing with similar HOA problems. Some asked for advice on organizing petition drives. Others wanted to know about the legal process for challenging HOA decisions. A few were dealing with HOA boards they suspected of financial impropriety and wanted to know how to get authorities involved. Amanda forwarded these emails to our board, and we discussed how to respond. We decided to create a simple guide based on our experience, outlining steps homeowners could take when dealing with problematic HOAs. George worked with a lawyer friend to make sure our advice was legally sound, and then we posted the guide on our HOA website and gave permission for anyone to share it. It felt good to turn our difficult experience into something that might help others. That had never been the goal when this started. I just wanted to get my chimney cleaned, but it was a meaningful outcome. Spring arrived, bringing beautiful weather to Scottsdale. I spent my weekends working in my yard, planting some new shrubs along my front walk. I submitted the required landscaping change request, and it was approved the same day. Simple as it should be, in April, I got a letter from the Arizona Attorney General's office. They were conducting a broader investigation into HOA financial management practices across the state, prompted in part by Patricia's case. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify before a state legislative committee that was considering new HOA oversight regulations. I agreed. The hearing was scheduled for early May at the state capitol in Phoenix. I took a day off work and drove up to testify. The committee room was surprisingly full, with dozens of people waiting to share their HOA stories. I testified for about 15 minutes, walking through my experience with Patricia and explaining how the lack of oversight had allowed her to embezzle for years without detection. I also talked about the reforms our new board had implemented and suggested that some of those reforms could be required by state law for all HOAs. Other witnesses told their own stories. Some were even worse than mine. One elderly couple had been foreclosed on by their HOA over a dispute about exterior paint colors, losing a home they'd lived in for 30 years. A veteran had been fined thousands of dollars for displaying an American flag, even though federal law protected his right to do so. The stories went on and on. The committee members seemed genuinely concerned. Several asked detailed questions about potential reforms and how they could be enforced. At the end of the hearing, the committee chairwoman said they would be drafting legislation to address the most serious issues and hoped to have a bill ready for the next legislative session. I left the Capitol feeling cautiously optimistic. Real change was possible. It would take time, but the momentum was building. Back in Oakmont Heights, life continued to improve steadily. The community was functioning well, the board was working effectively, and people were generally happy with their HOA for probably the first time in years. In June, I attended my final board meeting. My term wasn't up, but I decided not to run for re-election the following year. I'd served for over a year and had helped implement the reforms I thought were important. Now I wanted to step back and let others have a chance to serve. I announced my decision at that June meeting. George was disappointed but understanding. He said I'd be welcome back on the board anytime if I changed my mind. The other board members thanked me for my service. As I walked home from that meeting, I reflected on everything that had happened since that first frustrating denial of my chimney cleaning request. It had been exhausting, often infuriating, sometimes scary. But it had also been important and ultimately successful. My chimney was clean. Patricia was in prison. The HOA was functional. The community was healthier. And I'd played a meaningful role in making all of that happen. Sometimes standing up to power is worth it. Sometimes fighting back against petty tyrants and their arbitrary rules makes a real difference. I'd learned that lesson thoroughly over the past year and a half. That evening, I lit a fire in my fireplace, even though it was June and certainly didn't need the heat. I just wanted to enjoy it, to celebrate the ability to use my own fireplace in my own home without anyone's permission or interference beyond reasonable safety standards. The fire crackled and danced, and I smiled. It had been a long journey, but I'd gotten exactly what I wanted in the end. Plus a whole lot more that I never expected. Sometimes life works out that way. You start with a simple goal and end up transforming an entire community. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to clean his chimney. The following months passed quietly. My life returned to normal rhythms of work, home maintenance, and enjoying my house. The new HOA board continued functioning well under George's leadership. I attended occasional meetings just to stay informed, but I was no longer directly involved in the decision-making. In September, I heard that Patricia's house had finally sold. A young family with 2 kids moved in. I introduced myself when they were moving in, and they seemed nice. Normal people, just looking for a good place to raise their kids. I welcomed them to the neighborhood and didn't mention the house's history. They'd find out eventually from neighbors, but it didn't need to be the first thing they learned. That fall, I got an invitation to speak at a conference in Tucson about HOA governance reform. The conference was organized by a coalition of homeowner rights groups and housing policy advocates. I agreed to participate on a panel about fighting back against abusive HOAs. The panel was well attended, with maybe 200 people in the room. I shared my story again, along with 3 other panelists who'd had their own battles with difficult HOAs. The audience was engaged, asking lots of questions and taking notes. After the panel, several people approached me with questions or to share their own situations. One woman was dealing with an HOA president who sounded remarkably similar to Patricia, same controlling behavior, same arbitrary denials of reasonable requests. I gave her a copy of the guide we'd created and walked her through the steps, we'd taken to organize our community response. Another man told me his HOA had recently discovered financial irregularities and suspected embezzlement. I connected him with Detective Morrison's name and the name of the forensic accounting firm that had worked on our case. I couldn't give legal advice, but I could point him toward resources that might help. Driving home from Tucson that evening, I felt grateful for how everything had turned out. Yes, it had been a nightmare dealing with Patricia. Yes, I'd spent countless hours on petition drives and board meetings and legal research. But I'd also become part of something bigger than myself and had helped create positive change that would last beyond my involvement. The holidays came around again, marking 2 full years since the drama had started. The HOA holiday party was even better than the previous year. More people attended, the mood was festive, and there was a genuine sense of community. George pulled me aside at one point and told me that the HOA's finances were finally back on track. Insurance had covered some of the embezzled money, and they'd recovered a small amount from Patricia's restitution payments. It would take years to recover everything, but the community was stable. He also mentioned that he'd been contacted by state legislators who were working on the HOA reform bill. They wanted his input on specific provisions. The bill was expected to be introduced in the next legislative session, starting in January. I told George that was great news and that I hoped the bill would pass. Real structural reform could prevent other communities from going through what we'd experienced. As the year turned from 2024 to 2025, I found myself thinking about New Year's resolutions. I'd gotten into the habit of setting specific goals each year, though I didn't always achieve them all. This year, I decided my main goal was simply to enjoy my home. No drama, no battles, no fighting with authority figures. Just normal life in a well-maintained house in a functional community. It seemed like a modest goal, but after the past 2 years, it felt revolutionary. The fact that I could have such a simple, boring goal was a testament to how much had changed. January brought cold weather again, and I used my fireplace regularly. Each time I lit a fire, I thought briefly about the journey that had made this simple pleasure possible. Clean chimney, functioning HOA, reasonable rules. The basics of homeownership as they should be. In February, I heard that the HOA reform bill had been introduced in the state legislature. It included several provisions our experience had inspired, including mandatory financial audits for HOAs over a certain size, specific timelines for responding to homeowner requests, and stronger protections against retaliatory fines. The bill faced opposition from some HOA management companies and board members who thought it was government overreach. But homeowner advocacy groups rallied support, and the bill gained momentum. It passed the State House in March and the Senate in April. The governor signed it into law in early May. The new law would take effect in January 2026, giving HOAs time to adjust their procedures. It wasn't perfect, but it was real progress that would make life better for homeowners across Arizona. I felt proud to have played a small part in making that happen. If Patricia hadn't blocked my chimney cleaning request, none of this would have occurred. Her abuse of power had ultimately led to reforms that would constrain future abusers. There was a certain poetic justice in that. As spring turned to summer in 2025, I settled into a comfortable routine. Work was going well. My house was in good shape. The HOA was functional. I'd even started dating someone, a woman named Rachel I'd met through friends. Life was good. One evening in June, I got a call from Frank Delgado at Desert Clean Chimney Services. He said he was calling to remind me that it was time for my annual chimney cleaning. I checked my calendar and we scheduled an appointment for the following week. When Frank arrived, we chatted while he worked. He mentioned that business had been good lately, partly because more people were aware of the importance of regular chimney maintenance after all the publicity around Patricia's fire. He also said he'd gotten several calls from other HOAs asking about their requirements for chimney sweep contractors. Most of them were implementing much simpler approval processes than Patricia had imposed. The ripple effects of our situation were still spreading. Frank finished the job and gave me his usual thorough report. The chimney was in great shape, he said. No significant buildup, no structural issues. I'd be good for another year. I paid him, thanked him, and waved as he drove away. Such a simple transaction. Request service, get approval, have work done, pay bill. The way it should always have been. That weekend, I ran into George at a neighborhood garage sale. We chatted about HOA business, though there wasn't much to report. Everything was running smoothly, which meant there wasn't much to discuss. George mentioned that he'd decided not to run for re-election as board president the following year. He'd served 2 years and thought it was time for someone else to take the role. He was proud of what the board had accomplished, but ready to step back. I understood completely. Volunteer positions like that can be rewarding, but they're also draining. George had devoted countless hours to fixing the HOA and deserved a break. We talked about who might run for the board in the next election. Several newer residents had expressed interest. That was a good sign, indicating that people wanted to be involved rather than feeling alienated from the HOA as they had under Patricia's leadership. As summer progressed, I thought less and less about the HOA drama. It was becoming a story from my past rather than a present reality. That was healthy. Life moves forward. In August, I got a message through social media from someone I didn't know. Her name was Catherine, and she lived in Minnesota. She'd read about our situation through an article shared in an HOA reform group she belonged to. She was dealing with a similarly abusive HOA president and wanted advice. I spent an hour on a video call with Catherine, walking through what we'd done and what had worked. I emphasized the importance of organizing with other homeowners rather than fighting alone. I also stressed the value of documenting everything and understanding the HOA's own bylaws better than the board did. Catherine thanked me profusely and said she felt more hopeful about her situation. I gave her my email and told her to reach out if she had other questions. Over the following months, I heard from several more people in similar situations. Each time, I shared what I'd learned and tried to be encouraging. Some situations resolved quickly, others dragged on, but I was glad to help where I could. By the time autumn arrived in 2025, nearly 2 years had passed since the new board took over. Oakmont Heights was a completely different place than it had been under Patricia's reign. The change was remarkable. Property values in the neighborhood had actually increased, partly because the area had gained a reputation for having a well-run HOA. When potential buyers researched the community, they found recent news about reforms and improved governance rather than complaints about an abusive board president. In October, I attended a community meeting where the board presented a long-term capital improvement plan. They'd gotten input from residents about priorities and had developed a realistic budget for upgrading common areas and infrastructure over the next 5 years. The presentation was professional, transparent, and reasonable. People asked questions and the board gave clear answers. It was boring in the best possible way. After the meeting, I congratulated George and the other board members on their work. They truly transformed the HOA from a dysfunctional nightmare into a functional community organization. Walking home that evening, I noticed how peaceful the neighborhood felt. People were out walking dogs, kids were playing in yards, neighbors were chatting on sidewalks. It was the kind of community anyone would want to live in. I'd played my part in creating that atmosphere by standing up to Patricia and helping organize the petition drive. But dozens of other people had contributed too. It had been a collective effort, and we'd all benefited from the results. As I reached my house, I paused to look at it. The exterior was well maintained, the landscaping was neat, and smoke would be safely venting from the chimney come winter. It was mine, truly mine, in a way it hadn't felt when Patricia was controlling every detail of my life. That sense of ownership and freedom was what this whole fight had been about. Not just for me, but for everyone in Oakmont Heights. The right to enjoy your home without arbitrary interference. The right to make reasonable decisions about your property. The right to have a voice in how your community is run. These weren't radical demands. They were basic rights that every homeowner should have. But under Patricia's leadership, those rights had been trampled. Fighting back and reclaiming them had been necessary and worth every difficult moment. I went inside, made dinner, and relaxed for the evening. It was a Thursday night, nothing special, just normal life. And that normalcy was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The weeks turned into months, and before I knew it, another year was passing. The holidays came and went. My relationship with Rachel was getting more serious. Work was stable. The HOA continued functioning well. Life was good. In early 2026, the new state HOA reform law took effect. Oakmont Heights was already in compliance with most provisions since we'd implemented similar reforms on our own. But many other HOAs across Arizona had to scramble to meet the new requirements. I read news articles about HOA boards complaining about the new regulations. Some called them burdensome or unnecessary. I had no sympathy for those complaints. If the regulations felt burdensome, it was probably because those HOAs had been operating in ways that needed to be constrained. In February, I got an unexpected piece of mail. It was a check for $873 from the Arizona Department of Corrections. A letter explained that this was my share of restitution payments Patricia had made from her prison earnings and from the sale of assets. It wasn't much considering how much she'd stolen from the HOA overall, but it was something. I deposited the check and donated the money to a local homeowner advocacy organization. They were doing good work helping people deal with HOA problems, and I wanted to support that. Spring arrived, and with it came the annual HOA election. George kept his promise not to run for president again. A woman named Christine Valdez ran for his seat and won easily. She'd been attending board meetings regularly for the past year and had good ideas about community management. The election was uncontested and routine. That was another sign of how much things had changed. When Patricia was president, elections had been fraught with tension. Now they were barely worth noting. In May, I got a call from Melissa Warner, the lawyer I'd consulted back when I was considering suing the HOA. She'd seen my name in connection with the state HOA reform law and wanted to congratulate me. She said that in her practice, she'd already noticed HOAs becoming more reasonable in their dealings with homeowners. The new law was having an impact. We chatted for a few minutes, and then Melissa mentioned that she'd recently taken on a case that reminded her of my situation. An HOA was blocking a homeowner from making critical repairs to a retaining wall, and the delays were causing additional damage. She asked if I'd be willing to be an expert witness about HOA abuse if the case went to trial. I agreed, though I hoped it wouldn't come to that. Hopefully the HOA would settle once they realized they were in the wrong. As it turned out, they did settle. The threat of legal action, combined with the new state law's stronger protections for homeowners, convinced them to back down. The homeowner got to make the necessary repairs without further interference. Melissa sent me a thank you note even though I hadn't ended up testifying. She said just having my name on the witness list had helped motivate the settlement. I was glad I could help. Summer 2026 brought scorching heat to Scottsdale, as it always did. I spent most of my time indoors, enjoying air conditioning and being grateful I wasn't dealing with HOA drama on top of the heat. In July, Rachel and I decided to move in together. She'd been renting an apartment in Temp, and it made sense for her to move into my house since I owned it. We discussed whether the HOA would have any issues with her moving in, but under the bylaws, homeowners could have anyone they wanted living in their house. It wasn't the HOA's business. Still, out of an abundance of caution and force of habit, I sent a courtesy notification to the board letting them know Rachel would be moving in. The board president, Christine, responded within an hour welcoming Rachel to the community. Simple and appropriate. Rachel moved in over a weekend in August. It felt good to share my home with someone, and it was satisfying to do so without any interference from an overbearing HOA. As autumn approached, I realized it had been nearly 3 years since this whole saga began. Patricia was still in prison and would be for at least another year. The HOA she dominated was thriving in her absence. The reforms we'd implemented were working. The state law inspired by our experience was protecting homeowners across Arizona. It had been a long, difficult journey, but the destination was worth it. I'd stood up to an abuser, helped organize a community response, contributed to meaningful reform, and ultimately helped create a better living situation for hundreds of people. And it had all started because I wanted to clean my chimney. Sometimes life works in unexpected ways. The smallest grievances can lead to the biggest changes if you're willing to fight for what's right. As I sat by my fireplace one cool evening in October 2026, watching flames dance safely in a properly maintained chimney, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was my home in my community, governed by rules I'd helped reform. I'd earned this peace and this safety through struggle and persistence. The fire crackled, Rachel sat beside me reading a book, and outside the neighborhood hummed with the quiet contentment of a well-functioning community. This was everything I'd fought for. This was worth every frustrating email, every long meeting, every anxious moment wondering if the fight was worth it. It had been worth it. Every single moment. And somewhere in an Arizona prison, Patricia Henderson had years to contemplate the abuse of power that had brought her down. I didn't take pleasure in her suffering, but I didn't regret the role I'd played in holding her accountable either. Justice had been served. The community had healed. Life had moved forward, and my chimney was clean. That's all I'd ever wanted, really. The rest had been necessary consequences of someone standing in the way of that simple, reasonable goal. If Patricia had just approved my initial request back in September 2 years ago, none of the rest would have happened. She'd brought it all on herself through her arrogance and her inability to see past her own need for control. The fire burned lower, and I added another log. The flames leaped up again, warm and bright and safe. I smiled, settled back into the couch with Rachel, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of being home,